Are we ready?
We are live.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our online training course, Leadership as a Vehicle to Youth Participation, a training course organized by the National Agency of Cyprus of Erasmus Plus Youth, represented here by Stella Rousseau, and facilitated by me and my colleague Andreas Andreou. We would like to welcome you on this live streaming where Dan Moxon, a researcher, a youth worker with experience in youth participation from different perspectives, will give us an insight and input to have a better understanding on what youth participation is and not only. This is part of the training course where together with our participants, we are exploring and addressing youth participation, but also from this perspective where leadership comes in and where exactly does it come in. Hopefully you're going to enjoy what is coming, and I'm just going to pass the floor to Dan. Dan, thank you very much for joining.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And a really nice introduction as well. I mean, just to go on for that, to let people know, I've been working in things around youth participation for maybe 10, 15 years, depending on exactly how you count. I started off at local level as a youth worker, developing youth projects, youth forums. And these days, a lot of the things I do are much more research around participation, developing strategies, basically all these different avenues and ways of doing participation. These are things I've done over the years with one exception. I've never been an activist. I've never been, you know, some people in our field, they start off as a young campaigner and they're driven by passionate issues. I've never been that person. And that's really important to hold on to when you listen to what I've got to say, because participation is about two sides struggling to each other. You know, you have the young people on one side trying to express a view, trying to influence things. And you have the system, the decision makers, the men in suits maybe on the other side, who are the ones with some sort of duty to listen to young people, to respond to what they say. And I guess it's fair to say I'm a little bit more in that side of being part of the system rather than maybe a radical revolutionary. So the view I'm going to give you of participation is very practical. What I'm interested in is how can we improve Europe, improve society for young people across all of our communities. But it's not a view that says, and we need to burn everything down and start again. It's very practical, and it's about how we take steps towards improving the lives of young people. What am I going to do? We'll do this in two halves. So in the first half, I'm going to talk to you about the concept of participation, what it means, how we can think about it, what some of the big debates are in youth participation. And this is like really big picture stuff. And we'll then take some questions, some space to talk about that. As Kostas said, if you have any questions while we're going and you want to post them in the chat, please do. And then in the second half, I'm going to try and talk a little bit about, okay, if you're running a project or a program or some sort of activity for young people or with young people, maybe you're a young leader, maybe you're a youth worker, what does all of those things mean? What should you be thinking about when you are trying to do youth participation? What does it mean to do youth participation? There's going to be a lot of content in this. So a lot of things I'm just going to touch on a little bit and won't go into in huge amounts of detail. But I know this is one of the first parts in your training course. So these will be things you can come back to and explore over the years. Maybe not the years. I don't think the training course is quite that long. But so we're going to kick off then. What I want to do, we'll start at the very start, is give you a bit of a definition of youth participation. I'm going to share my screen with you. As you heard us talking, if you want to watch the graphic recording as well, feel free to go ahead and do that. Just to check everyone can see the screen okay, let me know if not. Okay. So this is a definition of youth participation. It's a little bit complicated. Whenever people write definitions, what happens is someone else comes in and says, oh, you need to add this bit in, you need to add this bit in. But I'll break this down for you and explain a little bit about what it means and make it a little bit simpler. And this definition comes from Salto Participation and Information's participation strategy. And that's a strategy for the Erasmus programs like and European Solidarity Corps. And it says youth participation is about individual young people and groups of young people having the right, the means, the space, the opportunities and the support to freely express their views, contribute to and influence societal decision-making on matters that affect them, and be active within their democratic and civic life, within the democratic and civic life of our communities. There's a lot of different things going on in there. But these 3 bullet points are the important things that we can talk about, and we'll simplify those a little bit. So it's about young people being able to express their views, to have some sort of influence by expressing those views, and generally to be active within our democracies. And I think you can think about participation in 2 different ways. One way is voice. This is the idea that young people will say something, either as a group of people, as an individual young person, maybe they'll do a campaign, a protest, maybe they'll vote, take part in a consultation, but in some way they will express their views and opinions to, we tend to use the term decision makers in participation a lot, but it could also be to democratic institutions, to teachers, to doctors, to politicians, anyone in our society that has a lot of power and makes decisions about how our society works. And we can think of participation basically about enabling young people to share their views and opinions with the people in power and the people who make decisions. The other way we can think about it is action. And this is rather than saying something to someone else and hoping that they'll do something about it, that you can take matters into your own hands, that you can organize an environmental thing to clean up a local beach, or you can organize activities in your community to make the kind of change you want to create. And these 2 things are slightly different, but they're both equally important to participation. Sometimes we tend to focus on the voice one just a little bit more. And that's often because, particularly when you look at participation of under 18s, it tends to think about this a little bit more. But you really can't say that one side is more important than the other side. And we're going to come back to this, of what it means to think about these 2 different halves later on. But what's really important about these is that they're both creating some sort of change. That the idea is that you are enabling young people to change society, to do something, to improve the world around them in the way that they want to see it improved. And that's basically what participation is about for me. It's working with young people to get them to create, or to give them a chance of creating a change in the world around them, to improve the world around them as the way they want to see it. And this is the difference between education and volunteering or any of the other things we might do in the youth sector and participation. That the really important thing is it's about the putting young people in the driving seat, giving them power and letting them create the change that they want to create. So if we come back to this expression a little bit, this definition, we'll look at a few of the other things in it. So first of all, there's a recognition that it can be about individual young people and groups of young people. You know, so one person on their own can participate, they can make some sort of change, but also the idea that young people have a sort of collective voice, that there may be things that are affecting all young people or some groups of young people that they want to come together around in order to change. And this is kind of this first part of this sentence. But then there's also this thing about the right, the means, the space, and the opportunities. And basically what that means is that this thing needs support, it needs help. Young people participation is a fundamental human right. So we're not going to go into that in too much detail, but it's always worth mentioning. But also you need to be able to participate effectively. You might need some help and support, maybe from a youth worker or a trainer. You might need the spaces in which you can participate and the tools with which to do it. So a lot of the time when we're making participation projects, we're trying to put those different things in place. And then just to touch a little bit on this last line, this idea about to be active within the democratic and civic life of our communities. There's something about participation which is always about the idea that you are, I like to think about the town square. Nobody really goes to the town square as much anymore, but if the town square in hundreds of years ago was the place you would go and shout about the things that concerned you, the place you would go and say, these are the issues that I'm bothered about, and talk to other people and have debates in those sorts of things. And this is almost, to me, what being active in democracy is like. It's going out into the public realm, into the civic space, and engaging with other people outside of your home, outside of the work, in the public sphere. And so this, broadly speaking, is what participation is. It's worth saying there are lots and lots of different definitions of participation. They all pretty much say this sort of thing, but in different sorts of ways, and they'll put emphasis on different parts and different ways. But if you hold on to that idea of voice, action, and creating change, you've got the basic concept for it. One of the big debates we see a lot is, well, what are the different ways that young people can participate? And this appears a lot in European youth policy, in national youth policy, and it also appears a lot in kind of academic research and literature. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and it has some effects. So the first way that people participate is at the ballot box. This doesn't need a lot of explaining. You all understand what voting is. And the key thing to understand and know about this in the context of youth participation is that pretty much not enough young people are voting, and pretty much the levels of youth voter turnout are falling every year. Some people argue in the last 4 or 5 years it's increased a little bit. That could just be a little blip along the way. But this is a really important thing to hold on to, because if we look at the future of Europe as a whole, the future of our countries, we know that basically younger generations vote less than older generations. We know that they tend to be less trustworthy of the political system and basically don't support our political parties and candidates as much as we would want them to. You can see there's a statistic here that says 64% of people say they voted in any political election in the last 3 years. That's young people. If you were to look at individual elections, sometimes you would find it's much lower than that, 10%, 20%, 30%. And that's a real issue. Our societies need everyone to be voting. They need to be trusting our governments. One of the other traditional forms of participation we can talk about is the idea of youth organisations. And these are the sorts of organisations where young people come together, form an association, form a society, and work collectively to represent their views politically. And about 53% of young people have been involved in a youth organisation in the past 12 months. This is according to the Flash Eurobarometer statistics. So quite a large number of young people are active in this sort of work. But what's really important to bear in mind is that youth organisations also do lots and lots of things. So I think about 29% of these people who are involved in youth organisations will be doing sports, which is really quite different to youth participation. We've got the logo of the Scouts in the middle. Scouts are a wonderful organisation. They're very politically active in national levels and European levels. But actually, for many people who are involved in the Scouts, what they're doing is getting their badges, going camping, making campfires. So there's not everything a youth organisation does is always youth participation. But it's a really important part of young people being able to come together and create vehicles for expressing their views. We can talk about the more alternative forms of participation as well. So sometimes we hear phrases like deliberative participation, co-production. We don't have a lot of space to go into this in huge detail, but this is an idea that you might organise something like a youth event or participatory budgeting or youth-led research, anything where you might say, bring groups of young people together to talk about an issue with a view of making some sort of change. It's really as simple as that. So the difference between these and, say, youth organisations is that you don't really have to become a member of this sort of thing. It's perhaps a little bit more informal, more flexible, but we see more and more youth programmes running this sort of work. And I'm sure you'll talk about these kind of alternative methods a little bit more as you get going over your training course. We can also talk about young people protesting. I'm sure you'll all recognise this picture here. And we sometimes, at the moment, particularly with the environmental movement, we risk being a bit too romantic about protesting. You know, we think it's absolutely fantastic that thousands and thousands of young people have been on the streets protesting about environmental issues. And while I think it is fantastic to see thousands, well, millions of young people expressing their views, it's also a failing of the democratic system. If people feel that they have to take to the streets because they've got no real way to have the influence they want, because voting, because the ballot box doesn't work, to have thousands and thousands of people protesting is actually a sign of an unstable society and an unhealthy democracy. And also it's important to bear in mind, not all protests are as nice and friendly as the environmental movement. You can talk about much more extreme left-wing or right-wing protests that are much more violent for maybe causes that are perhaps maybe anti-LGBT or anti-human rights, these kind of things. So protest isn't automatically good. Another method of participation you can talk about is activism. And this is, again, we touched on this a little bit with the idea of young people doing actions together. And if you contrast, the picture in front of you is called from the Trash Tag Challenge. And this is basically where groups of young people organize to do cleanup of beaches, of parks. And the key difference here, these two pictures really show the difference between voice and action. In this example, in the protest movement, what young people are doing is trying to get politicians to improve the environment, to pass laws, to change the way carbon is used or what our policies are around transport, all of these kind of things. In this activity, where young people get together and do things themselves to improve the environment, they're not relying on anyone else to create that change. They're going out and saying, do you know what, we're not interested in talking to politicians to make this change. We can just clean up our park. We can just clean up our beach. And this is a very important part of participation. We know about 31% of young people have been involved in voluntary activities in the last 12 months. Then you get to these sort of slightly different things that maybe they're participation, maybe they're not. The poster you can see in front of you is a poster from a club night. This is in the city of Manchester, near to me, and it is organised as a space for young people to explore new ideas about gender, about being queer, and it's a very, very interesting space to be in. But it really allows people to express themselves in different sorts of ways, and it's about creating a very different sort of community as a response to the community around it. It's run by young people in their 20s to 30s. And sometimes you can look at this and go, well, this is a really radical form of participation. Someone they colonized an old building on the edges of the city and really transformed it into something different. Other times you can look at it and go, but it is just a nightclub. Is this participation? Does it really count? Or is this just a group of people going out and having a good time? And there's lots of examples like this. You can see people setting up communes, squatting, that if you look at them one way, you can say, yeah, this is kind of about people influencing society. Another way, maybe it's not. And then the final sort of participation we can talk about is the idea of digital participation. Now, often people talk about this like it's a different type of participation, but the truth is any of these different forms of participation we've talked about so far, you can recreate in an online space. So in the same way we're in a training course now that's been recreated digitally, you can recreate a youth organization in an online space. You can recreate activism movement in an online space. If you look at what the environmental movement is doing with young people, they're still protesting online. They're doing kind of banner showing on Instagram and these sorts of things. But there is a risk in digital participation that it becomes very, very disconnected. You know, remember we talked a lot at the start about participation being about being out there in the town square. It's about influencing the world, influencing society. And I think you can really question if what you're doing is in the privacy of a Facebook group or a Tumblr channel or a TikTok channel, does this have any, what sort of connection does this have to the physical world? And particularly what sort of connection does it have to policymakers? Thousands and thousands of young people, say, signing an online survey or joining a Facebook group in support of a particular cause, maybe doesn't have any actual influence on what's going on in the town hall or what's going on in the governments and the parliaments of Europe. If we move on a little bit, we can really see the key debates in participation. They come back to this idea that on the one hand, there's a group of things that we know are going down, and these are what we call these traditional forms of participation. So we know that young people are voting less, we know they're less likely to be involved in political parties, they're less likely to trust institutions, and that's a really serious concern. We need to bring people back to those democratic institutions. And this is a very strong narrative and something that's really concerning a lot of policymakers, and I think should really concern everyone. It's really important to have a very healthy democracy. And the flip side of that, we have a group of things that we say are going up. And some of this comes from, there's a point where researchers started to ask, okay, if we know that people are voting less, they're less engaged in politics, does that mean that young people are disinterested? Are they, do they not care about politics? Do they not care about the future of our society? So there was quite a lot of good research that was done on this. And what came back was, no, actually, young people really, really care about politics, about what goes on in the world, but they tend to express it in different ways compared to previous generations. So they're more likely to join social movements, they're more likely to support what we call single issue causes. So this is like the environmental movement. Rather than joining a youth association, they might be more likely to join a movement that supports a single cause. Some people say they're more likely to do things like volunteering and protest. Of course, we know that use of the internet is much, much more common. We simply didn't have that 10, 20 years ago. Even when I was growing up, I remember getting broadband for the first time at home. So the space with which people have online to express and debate and engage with each other really just didn't exist a few years ago. And so generally the narrative we talk a little bit about is young people turning to what we call these alternative forms of participation. And this is a really important debate, these traditional forms versus the alternative forms. So the traditional forms are basically membership of a political party, voting, perhaps membership of a youth organization or a trade union. And the alternative forms are kind of everything else. It's actually quite badly defined what the two things are. And one of the things you see policymakers do is say, what we need to do is really find new ways to promote the alternative forms of participation. And this is how I would describe most youth policymakers and their attitude to participation over the past 4 or 5 years, that they're really, really interested in promoting things like digital tools for engaging with young people, things like co-production, participation. And then as a result of that, what's happened is a lot of the more traditional forms in the youth sector, the youth organizations, get a bit left behind. They get a bit ignored by the policymakers, they get a bit less listened to. And recently they've started to call this the shrinking space for civil society. So the idea that that some policymakers have, that youth organizations are very perhaps old-fashioned, they don't represent all young people, and that what we should be doing is really using lots and lots of different ways to engage young people other than youth organizations, and that youth organizations are something of the past. But of course, if we go back to our definition of what participation was, a really important part of it was about people being able to associate with each other, to create structures for themselves, to lead things for themselves. And an active civil society is a really, really important part of participation. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't space for youth organizations to modernize, to improve what they're doing. There's the space in any kind of work to do that. But really, you can really need to understand this is quite an important way that makes policymakers much more inclined to listen to, say, if you go to them with a new website for engaging young people, they'll tend to be much more excited about it than a youth organization. Now, of course, in all of this, we need to touch a little bit on the idea of Corona and what does Corona mean? How has that affected participation? And that's a really difficult question to answer. It's difficult because Corona has only been happening for a few months. The kind of research into the effect of that on young people is still emerging. And it's probably fair to say that the research on Corona and young people is mostly focused on what's the impact on their education, the impact on their employment, their impact on their mental health and well-being. And those are probably some of the key issues. What sort of effect does it have on participation is a very different sort of question to ask. Now, again, going back to that idea of participation, being able to, about going out into the public square, meeting with other groups of young people, finding a way to express yourself, finding a way to create a change. Clearly, we've had a place for many countries where just we haven't been able to physically meet. So it's really stopped a huge amount of youth programs and youth projects. Hopefully that's a temporary thing and we'll be moving away from that soon. But what we have seen in the sector is a massive rush in the need to use digital tools. And I don't think I need to go into detail about why that is. But I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that some of you might have heard the phrase, if you put 1 million monkeys at 1 million typewriters, eventually one of them will write the full works of Shakespeare just by chance. And my kind of view is that's a little bit like what we're going through with digital participation at the moment. I think the youth sector, for various reasons, was not particularly good at digital participation. There is a difference between knowing that lots of young people use the internet to express themselves and running really good quality digital participation programs, really good quality things in online spaces that enable young people to influence society. And we hadn't put a huge amount of attention to it. It was maybe a 5–10% of what we were doing in the field of participation. Now, suddenly, everyone is doing this really, really quickly. And I think what we'll see after 6 months, a year, when we come to the end of Corona and we can look back on all the tools and techniques we've developed, is lots and lots of really new and exciting ways to do participation in an online space. So we're talking about groups of people who a year ago maybe didn't know how to run an online event or conference. Now pretty much everyone knows how to do this sort of work, or everyone working in projects, because we've had to learn how to do it very quickly. So it's almost like we're in the middle of this really big test bed where we'll try out lots of different ways to use digital tools and use digital techniques. But I think a really big part of that is thinking about how we communicate and engage and recruit young people in online spaces. So we're seeing a lot people who work in marketing and communications, their skills are becoming really increasingly useful, because it's one thing to run a Zoom call with 10 people who used to be in your youth project, but it's a totally different thing to set up a digital participation project from scratch and go out and try to recruit people you've only ever met or you've never met before and recruit them through online means and online modes. And you see some really interesting things that happen in that, because online communities are not necessarily geographic communities. So you might be working with 30 young people from across 10 different countries rather than 15 people from just your town. I think this is a good place to pause and take any questions. I can see there's a few in the chat. Kostas, do you want to hand over to you and you can put a few questions to me? And, yeah.
Yes, Dan, sure. Thank you. We do have 2 questions, and please feel free to add your comments or feedback or questions for clarifications to Dan. But I would like to start with Nicholas Christofis from Cyprus, and I would actually like to give him the floor to place the question himself. Nicholas?
Hello, Kostas. Hello, Dan. Great to see you again.
Great to see you.
My question is about the future of youth participation and how you will be in the 10 or 20 years.
Oh, I've never been asked that before. That's a really hard question. I think if I look back 10 years, what we were trying to do 10, 20 years ago was persuade people that it was worth listening to children and young people, that it's something we should do. I think pretty much for about a lot of our democracies, that argument is starting to be accepted now. And so now what we're doing is trying to make the different tools to understand how we do that. You know, we spent a long time trying to say you really should listen to young people really should have an active say in our societies. And now we're at a place where what we're trying to do is work out what are the best methods for doing that, what are the effective methods for doing that. We can be a little bit more critical about the work we're doing and say, actually, that type of project, maybe it isn't so good. Once we get through that, what I think we'll see is 2 things happening, or what I hope we'll see. One is that we can start to move participation out of the youth sector a little bit more and to other areas of decision making. So rather than just thinking about, can young people have a voice when we create youth clubs in a town, when we design a national youth policy, let's think about when the economic strategy for an area is created. How do young people have a voice in that? When new roads or transport infrastructure are built, how do young people have a voice in that? So we're really, when healthcare is built, how do young people have a voice in that? So we're really thinking about mainstreaming young people's voice across all the different areas of decision making in society. And that will involve persuading people who have been less persuaded over the years to listen to young people, because, you know, if your job is to make railways, you're just not really thinking about this sort of thing. You know, we need to work with those kind of people. And then at the same time, I think the people who are kind of at the heart of participation are going to have to be increasingly thinking about the idea that different groups of young people have different views and opinions, and we're going to have to think about intersectionality more and more. So sometimes we kind of assume that young people, they're like a set of bees and they're all connected and they have a hive mind and they all think the same thing. But of course, if you're a black young person from the south of London compared to a white French young person in the middle of Paris, your life experiences might be very, very different. You might be affected as much by your experiences of being black as being young, or being white as being young. Or if you're a young person with a disability, you might be much more interested or are concerned about disability issues than kind of youth issues, if you can even split up issues in that way. So we're going to have to be a little bit more reflective on the idea that different groups of young people have different views. Not all young people share the same positions, and to get to grips with what that means for enabling them to influence society without undermining the sort of work we're doing. Where I'd really like to see it go in future is for us to be much, much bigger scale. Most of the participation work we do, there are some fantastic projects. That if you take, say, a National Youth Council, there's really lots of great National Youth Councils. But if you were to go and find someone in the street and say, have you ever heard of your National Youth Council? Do you know what it is? Do you know what it does? A lot of young people wouldn't know. They wouldn't know where they could go to have their voice heard. They wouldn't know that those things exist. So I'd really like to see us kind of scale up and be much better at communications and marketing, so that anyone on the street can know where they can go to get involved in participation. I don't know whether we'll achieve that, but that's where I'd like to see it go in future anyway. But yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the question. Certainly not an easy question for Dan or anyone else, but I really like, Dan, how before talking about the future, we went a little bit back on the past and see how things have been developing first up to now, and then look into the future and have some predictions or some hopes as well. Mm-hmm. We do have another question from Stella Rousseau from the Cypriot National Agency. Stella, can I pass you the floor to raise your question?
Yeah, thank you, Kostas. Thank you, Dan, for a very interesting presentation. From the Erasmus Plus perspective, we've noticed that a lot of the projects of our beneficiaries were put on hold and were postponed due to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, how will this impact the participation of young people in the future?
Mm-hmm. I think you can talk about the group of young people who've been who've just had their lives put on hold, I think, is the bigger question. You know, it's not just missing out on the Erasmus project, it's missing out on, you didn't get to go to school or college for a year, you didn't get to see your friends. So I think you've got a group of young people who are going to have had their life chances quite significantly reduced. So their opportunity to get involved in education, employment, access to healthcare, all of these kind of things. And that's going to have affected people in an unequal way. So the people that are already marginalized in our societies, the young people I think most research is starting to indicate, and we can be fairly sure that it will have affected those more. So I think what that means for participation is a couple of things. One is depending on how governments respond to the pandemic and depending on how governments respond to what has happened to young people, will make a significant difference about whether young people feel they trust our governments, whether they feel they trust our states. Basically, if they put the burden of fixing corona and the impact of corona onto young people, it's going to really increase the way that people feel disaffected by modern political institutions and make them much more less willing to engage in those, much more willing to promote and push radical change. Maybe it'll push people towards populism. Because I think it's not just corona, you have to think about the money we're spending now to keep the world ticking over. There's going to be a point where the governments say we need to cut things or bring that back to compensate for that. And that may have a much more significant effect longer term on young people's lives. And if they feel like we already have a massive problem of intergenerational inequality, that the older generations basically have much more of the resources than the younger generations. So if that gets more and more exaggerated, you'll really increase the way that young people don't feel that democracy serves them, that the state serves them, that the government serves them. And they're going to really going to look to turn much more strongly away from those things. How that plays out then is quite difficult to know. I think you might see a rise of populist movements. You might see a rise of counter-protest and extremism. It'll be really hard to say where that goes, but it's certainly very risky for the stability of our societies.
Thank you, Dan. Another question from Andreas Panagiotou from Cyprus. Andreas?
Yeah, sure. So basically what I see lately, it's like the academic and scientific community promoting projects that are community-based, based on the needs and the wills of the community. So the question is how youth participation organizations could line up with that approach, which is very interesting to see because it's literally non-formal education.
I can answer that with a personal story, really. The point at which I not stopped being a youth worker, but started to be a researcher rather than a youth worker, was I was working at a regional youth forum, and we were running lots of events for young people, lots of consultations, producing reports that say, this is what young people in our region think about this, that, and the other, all of these usual kind of participation activities. And then one day there was a piece of money for research to basically do those sorts of things. And so that we could get the money, because it was an NGO and you always have to get the money, we called what we were doing research. And I thought, oh, someone's going to call us out. They're going to pretend this isn't academic and scientific work, that it's not proper research, but they never did. And what I noticed was two things. One is that if you give any kind of engagement work that records young people's voices, that capture what young people are saying, the kudos of being a piece of research. If you say this is good enough quality to consider it research, it's considered more valid. It's considered that it should be more heavily listened to, that it is somehow scientifically rigorous and valid in these kind of ways. And exactly as you've said, the sorts of things that the academic and scientific community, or some parts of it, were doing, is really very, very similar to non-formal education, to consultations with young people. So I think there's a huge amount of space for academics and youth organizations and youth practitioners to collaborate together to basically give young people's voice the value that it deserves, which is recognizing that young people are creating knowledge when they say things about the world, and that's a knowledge that should be listened to. And so I think there's really a lot of space for collaboration between those two halves. And as I've moved further into the research half, and what I find is you then have to have some discussions about what counts as research, what doesn't count as research, what counts as consultation. But I would say if any, on a practical level, if any organization has an opportunity to work with those institutions, it's definitely something I would encourage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We will go back to Nicolas that has a very short and very relevant question. Nicolas?
Dan, last week we participated to the 3rd European Youth Work Convention. I saw that you was there.
Mhm.
And we realized that in every EU country, the recognition of youth work is different, or in many countries we don't have either recognition of youth work or a youth worker. Do you believe that youth work can be the vehicle to increase youth participation?
I feel you might burn me alive if I answer this question, because I don't think my response is going to be a popular one. First of all, let me say I think the recognition of youth work is very important and is absolutely a worthwhile thing to do, and is something we should be doing to promote and value youth work in informal education. I think we risk sometimes assuming that youth work is the answer to all of young people's problems, and that youth work is because we are in the youth sector, sometimes when we start to use youth work tools and non-formal education to do participation work, we sometimes present, I've seen many kind of consultations with young people where they do like a brilliant piece of work finding out what affects their lives. And really what young people are saying is change the way the doctors work, change the way the education system works. And they don't say much about youth work, but then somehow the youth workers at the end, the conclusion always manages to say, this is why we need better youth work or something like this. So what I would say is I think these structures, these tools of youth work and informal education, they are a very important thing for doing parts of what happens in youth participation. So things like co-production, deliberative events, running youth organizations. So they're very, very crucial. Recognition of youth work is really important as a profession to help that part of it tick along. But actually the sort of scale of participation we're talking about is bringing hundreds and thousands of young people to the ballot box, bringing hundreds and thousands of young people to engage with governments, engage with parliaments. And that is much bigger than youth work has been and is in young people's lives. And I think sometimes we run the risk of sort of assuming that the very, very good work we do in youth work can just be increased endlessly to solve the issues in youth participation. But you would need so many youth workers to do that. If you imagine one youth worker maybe works with 30 young people over the course of a project. And, you know, if you work out those numbers, we just could never have that many youth workers. And we always need more youth workers. But there's a point where you have to say youth work and informal education is one thing that goes on in young people's lives. There are many, many other things. And participation needs to happen in the doctor's office, in the school, at the town hall, and we won't have a youth worker at every one of those places. So maybe not the most popular answer, but that's the one I've come to over the years.
But certainly an answer with food for thought for every single one of us that is working on the field with young people. Last question for this part. We have Mario from Italy, and then we will continue to the second part, Dan, if that's okay.
Yep.
Mario?
Hello, and thank you for your speech. I wanted to ask about something that I've seen happening in my experience as a Red Cross volunteer, because sometimes youth participation is seen as something useless or a waste of time. So young volunteers that engage in organizations are kind of excluded by their peers for this activity. What would you suggest to motivate a volunteer that sees his possibility to participate as a potential danger to his relationships and kind of role in his social groups?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, you have to think about what you're inviting them to be involved in and what the value of that is to people. And I would perhaps, there's an important thing about situating participation projects into safe spaces that people feel that they enjoy, that people feel that they want to be part of. And so that a participation project isn't necessarily something that happens just on its own, that you don't have to have this is the youth club that happens on Wednesday nights where all the fun and the cool things happen. And this is the participation project that happens on Thursday nights where all of the geeky kids go who want to talk about politics. You kind of need to bring those things together. And so for me, it's about bringing the participation projects into the, if I say cool spaces, it just makes me sound really out of touch, but I think you hopefully get what I mean there.
Yeah.
And there is something to learn from marketing and branding about how to present what it is that we're doing to people. And sometimes the messaging we use about participation is very, and the messaging we use about a lot of youth projects is very clunky, very poor. So we'll talk, you need to do a piece of work thinking about what are the things that are really appealing to young people to join a participation project at the very start. And it's usually not things like it's your civic duty to have your voice heard, or you can learn and develop and this is something good to put on your CV. The messages that you need to think about are, this is actually fun. This project that we're running is interesting. You'll get to meet and hang out with other people. There's some free food. It's a social space. It's an enjoyable environment to be with. The staff and the workers you have there are trustworthy people that you can relate to, that feel like you. They're not people who are going to preach at you and tell you you should do certain sorts of things. And I don't have this in my presentation, but if you Google something called features to benefits conversion, it's a tool in marketing. And you basically make a list of all of the features of your project. So that could be that it runs on Thursday nights, it has 10 people in it, its aim is to do this, and try and describe it as a benefit to the person who's taking part, and to explain what the benefit of someone joining a project is, or of joining a particular opportunity is. And that really, it's just like a little thought activity to go through that really shifts how you think about what you're talking to people about. And the other way in for me is just to start by saying, what annoys you about the world? What do you want to change? Because everyone is fundamentally a bit frustrated about something. There's always something you want to change, and to build on the issues and the interests and the things that affect them. Those would be the two key things for me.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Dan. And really making youth participation attractive is a key question. A question.
It needs to be more than attractive. It needs to be sexy. It needs to be sexy.
Yeah, that's the right word. Okay, I would suggest that we go on, Dan, and we will also see what kind of questions come up that you can address at the end, if that's okay with you.
No problem.
No problem.
Okay.
Great. So we've done this kind of big picture stuff. What I want to do is try and bring it back around to say, okay, if you're running a project, if you're designing a project, what should you be thinking about? And I'm going to give you a couple of different sort of models and theories. We don't have the time to go into detail on each different one, but if you want us to look at them in a little bit more detail in the questions, we can do. And I'm pretty confident there'll be things that you will pick up throughout the rest of your training course. But what I want to try and do here is just cover here's the big sort of things to really consider in a project. And if you're setting up something, maybe that's with Erasmus Plus and Solidarity Corps, but it could be any sort of youth project or program, really. So the first thing is the idea of making change. And we've talked about this a little bit already, that what you have to be doing for it to be a participation project is to be enabling young people to have some realistic chance of creating a change in the world about them. If you're not doing that, you're doing volunteering, or you're doing education or cookery classes or whatever. This is the really fundamental thing. Now, this is quite a challenging thing to work with because you can't always guarantee that you'll make a change. If your starting point for running a project is to work with a group of young people and say, what do you want to change about your town? You can't guarantee that you will actually create that change, because you would have to be in charge of everything to be able to give that guarantee at the start of the project. So that's a really tricky sort of thing to navigate. You have to be really honest with your participants at the start of something, that you have a fundamental commitment as someone supporting a project to try and help them create that change, but you don't know that it's going to happen and you can't guarantee it, but you can guarantee that you're going to be by their side, not blocking them in trying to create that change, and not saying, oh, we shouldn't do that sort of thing. That doesn't mean you can't give advice on what might be less likely to be successful and what might be more likely to be successful. To give you an example of that, how that might work, in a regional project I ran for many years, we would once a year pick the different topics we wanted to work on, and the young people would choose it. And you imagine in this project over the years, different people come and go because people grow up and move on. And every year the topic of improving buses would come up. And we would always want to do a campaign on improving buses. And one year we did quite well with this campaign, and the people in charge of the buses in the region came back to us and said, I mean, we totally agree with everything you're saying, but at the end of the day, we just haven't got the money to make buses better. We're not making them bad deliberately, we just don't get enough money. And so from that point, we started to realize that the chances of our campaign to improve buses being successful was basically pretty much zero. And so the way we would approach our projects when this issue came up with young people saying, we want to work on this topic, we want to try and create this change, would be to say, we will happily support you to run a campaign around this, to do something around this. Here's what we've learned from the past. We think it's very unlikely to be successful, but my commitment to you as a youth worker is that I'm willing to try and do that with you, and we'll learn from what's happened before. And then that allows people to make a choice about what sort of changes they want to create, what sort of things they want to aim for. And an important part of this is creating change is also going back to that idea of voice and action, is to be really clear which one of those modes you're working in. Are you trying to basically do a piece of work where you're working with young people to get other people to make the change, or to implement the change themselves directly? And that really frames your project design from the start. But that authenticity is really the huge, most important thing of that, being really clear that you will help people try to make this change, but you can't guarantee it. And you can think about where change happens at a number of different levels. I won't go into this model in detail, but it's from the ecological model of change, and it's a version adapted for youth participation. So change starts from giving the individual young people better increased knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So basically learning and development. That might allow them to influence family, friends, social networks. This is at the interpersonal level, where they can start to mobilize as leaders to bring other groups of young people to support them in this project. That might lead to them being able to take charge of running an organization, like running a youth organization, running a schools forum, and actually setting up some sort of formal structures, designing projects themselves. Those kind of things can lead on to making changes in the community, because you can see you have to mobilize quite large amounts of people. And when you get to that sort of stage, you might have some realistic chances of influencing public policy, some politics, some laws at local, national and regional level. And so change can happen at all of these different dimensions. And there's a lot to unpick in this, so we won't go much further into it. But your basic starting point for thinking about a youth program or a youth project is that a lot of the time what you're doing is increasing people's competencies, developing their knowledge, their skills and attitudes, so that they can apply those and create changes at these additional levels. And you've got a long way to go before you can change a national law. You have to really run very large scale projects and pieces of work if your aim is to change the law around voting age or something like that. But if your aim is to basically improve the way that your school runs, or improve the way that young people with disabilities are treated in a small neighborhood, these changes are much easier to affect because they're much closer to the individual in that sort of sense. The other thing we can think about is the idea of participation in projects and the importance of projects themselves being youth-led. So we've talked a lot so far about a project is a tool to create some sort of change, but it is also a space within which people can take charge of how a project is run, of how a project is designed, of what's going on in that project. And I'll show you a model for that. This is based on a concept of Tresidder's degrees of participation. I'm sure you'll probably use the ladder of participation later on in your training course. This is a slight variation on this. And basically the thinking is when you design a project for young people, there are decisions that are made about that project, the topic of the project, where it takes place, what the activities are. And if you're a youth worker or a young leader and you make all of those decisions yourself, you're not working in a participative way. You're not giving the young participants, the young people you're working with, the opportunity to shape, to influence what that project is. You're not making it a participative project. What you're actually doing, this is this top box, the one in red, is you're designing a project and you're telling project participants, okay, I'm running this event next week. You can turn up to it, you can take part in it, but you don't really have a say in what it is. It's just up to you whether you come or not. So this model of training course is a little bit like that. You know, it's been designed by the organizations hosting it, it's been designed by the trainers, but you as participants, your only real choice probably was whether or not you came or whether or not you didn't come in that sense. There's nothing wrong with that style of work, but it's not participative. It's not a participatory work. You can take a little step up from that and go to this box on the left here. Youth workers, young leaders consult with participants. This is where, say, you're thinking about doing a project as a youth worker, and before you develop the project plan, before you decide what you're going to do, you go and ask the young people you're working with, well, what would you like it to be? Would you like to do what sort of things are you interested in? What sort of projects could we do? And you would then go away and still design and run the project yourself. You are still the leader in that project. You're not enabling your participants to be leaders in the project, but you are asking their opinions. You are asking their views at the start of it. Now, going back to the question we just had about essentially how to make participation more attractive, sometimes you have to work in this mode. You know, your good starting point there is to go and have conversations with people and say, what would you like out of a participation project to make sure you're doing the right sort of thing? Not everyone gets involved straight away by designing and leading a project. You have to have these stepping stones for people. The other way you can think about that is if you go over to this box at the right and you want to increase the degrees of participation a little bit and the amount of leadership that young people are able to take, is the idea that youth workers stroke young leaders initiate a project and that they share the decision making with the project participants. So you might say, okay, I'm starting a project. I need to design the activities for it. I need to design the plan for it, but I know it's going to be on this particular topic. And the first stages of your project are you sitting down with your project participants, making those choices together. And in that kind of way, people can learn how to design a project, how to run a project. It's very, very useful for the people's first steps in it. But the initial idea still comes from the youth worker or the young leader. And when I say young leader in this context, I kind of mean, I just want to recognize that not all youth workers are these kind of recognized, professionally qualified youth workers. There's groups of people who are more like young leaders in that sense. Now that's compared to the previous model where you were just asking people what they think, but still going and making all the decisions yourself. This is what you call a higher level of participation. The degree of participation is increased. You can go down to this bottom left-hand corner and you can increase the degrees of participation even more. And this is where the project participants initiate a project, and they go on and then share the decisions with the youth workers and the young leaders. So as a youth worker, you might be making yourself available, and maybe you're running a youth house or something, and you're saying, okay, if anyone wants to start a project, I've got all the information, I've got all the tools, come to me with your ideas and we'll work on them together. And what that does compared to the other model is it allows the participants, the young people, to set the direction of the project, to decide what the topic is, but they're still working and collaborating with you as a youth worker to help you to design and run the project, to make sensible choices about how it works, maybe to fit it into your organization's strategy. And that's very, very useful because it allows you to make sure that things are happening safely. It allows you to give people advice on what they've done in previous ways. And so that would be one of the higher degrees of participation. And if you go over to the box on the right-hand side, you can also imagine a type of project where basically the people who are participants in the project come together, as you might say, it was an informal group of young people, but it could also be formalized through a structure, but that everyone who is a participant in a project are the people who set up the project, are the people who run the project, you know, a group of people collaborating together to run this sort of an initiative where every single one of them is taking decisions, is leading the project, is shaping it. The important part of this is not to say that one particular model is better than another, that you should always be aiming for these two at the bottom, which are the highest degrees of participation when you're designing things, because people need different things at different times. If you're working with, clearly to do this one in the bottom right, for people to set up and run a project themselves, they need to have quite a high level of skills to do that. And the way they can develop those skills is perhaps by collaborating with you through the model on the left in a previous project. But if you've got a group who are perhaps maybe less interested in doing this sort of thing, unlikely to see a project through, actually there's a real benefit to just working in this consultative model, this one on the top left here, that what you're doing is giving people choices, giving people a say in what happens in the project, but you're still leading and taking a lot of the actions as the worker supporting it. So picking the right sort of leadership model for the context you're working in and the needs of the young people you're working with. You can imagine a lot of this varies quite a lot depending on the age range you're working with, is really, really important. The only one that kind of stands out is this red box at the top. This is the only one you would say, give or take, is not being participative. But even then, you can still run a participation project on this basis. So if you can imagine that you are, your goal is to educate young people about the importance of voting, and you design a project, you run it, and you go and deliver hundreds of workshops in schools that tells them about the importance of voting, you know, tells them how to vote, this kind of thing. That's still a valuable project to do. It's just not a participative project in itself. So for me, the important thing is about being really clear which of these leadership models you're working in, and making a choice that fits the needs of the groups of young people you're working with, because it's important not to rush to say we have to have the highest degree of participation possible, because projects also need to be successful, they also need to run to a budget, and sometimes people need the opportunities just to have a little bit of participation so that you can build things up in a second project further down the line. Kind of connected to that for me is the idea of outreach and inclusion. So one of the things that, if you go back to those headline discussions we had, that youth voter turnout is falling, there are some groups of young people who are very politically motivated, but not everyone is engaged in participation and informal institutions. There's a really important thing to make sure that your projects are working with people from all different sorts of backgrounds, and that there is a sort of equality of access to your projects. And you can think about two different things in this. Quite often this debate gets a bit muddied into the idea of making sure you don't just work with the usual suspects, and we say these very vague things about reaching out to different groups of young people. But if you imagine this idea going back to that previous model, that what you're thinking of doing is offering opportunities to more people to bring them in, to increase their roles as leaders. There is a stage in any project where you need to be thinking about contacting young people who are not already involved in youth participation activities, informing them about the possibility to get involved, and that could be the consultation stage of the cycle, or it could be that red bit that was non-participative. Outreach can be a stage in your project where you try to attract more participants to join the activities, but it can also be the main purpose of a project, to bring people, say, into your youth organization, into your youth forum. And there is something really important for me about, as a whole within participation, we need to do that thing of scaling up to making sure that we contact and inform as many young people as possible about the opportunity to take part. That's what I would call outreach. Kind of connected to that, but different, is the idea of inclusive participation. And so for me, a very fundamental part and value of youth participation is the idea of inclusive access and making sure that young people from different social backgrounds all have the opportunity to participate in society. And that can mean two different things in a project. One approach is to say that, okay, we're running, say, a local youth forum for our town. We want to make sure that people with disabilities, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people with chronic illnesses have the same chances to take part in that youth forum as other young people, that no one is particularly excluded. And so in that, what you would be doing in that style of project is thinking about, okay, who are the people in our community that we need to attract to our project? Who's currently missing? What are the barriers that are preventing them getting involved? And how can we remove those barriers? So if you were looking at, say, how you would include young people with learning difficulties, you might then be putting additional support in place for them to understand what was going on in the meetings, to have accessible communication. Remember, if you go right back to that definition of youth participation at the start, it talked about having the right, the means, and the support to be included. So the different levels of support that different groups might need becomes really, really important there. And so that's what I would call running an inclusive project. You should always be, from my view, aiming towards doing that sort of thing, but you'll also never achieve it. You can always find more and more groups who are excluded. But as well as that, there's a different style of things. If you remember when we talked about the question of what does the future of participation look like, I said, I talked a little bit about the idea of recognizing that not all young people have the same views and opinions. So it's imagine, say, trans young people or non-binary young people. They're a very, very small group of young people percentage-wise in the population. It's maybe something like, it's not even very well estimated, but it's a few percent. So if you are running a large democratic project and you remove all the barriers to trans young people taking part, and once a year what you do is say, what are the big issues? And the group goes through a process of deciding by consensus what the issues they want to work on are, they're very, very unlikely to reflect the views of the things that might be important to those trans young people. They'll talk about things like buses, about education, about things that are much more common. Not that those issues won't be important to the trans young people, but there will never be enough critical mass for that group to come together to have a space to say, actually, what we really care about is the way that we have to declare our gender in school or access to these kind of healthcare treatments. So one of the things you can do in participation or with a participation project is create a dedicated space for a specific group of young people who are less likely to get their voices heard. And so that could be young people with disabilities, it could be young migrants, it could be young refugees. It depends on what's going on in your community. If you know that there is a group of young people who are often very marginalized and excluded, you can create programs or initiatives specifically for them to make sure that the topics that are important to them that might not come up in, let's call it a mainstream participation project, can be represented properly. So one of the projects I run is for young people with chronic illness, and it's basically a standard kind of leadership program for young people, but the things that they care about and that they talk about are really not the same topics that come up in a youth forum, because they're talking about access to medicines, non-discrimination when getting healthcare, how early multiple sclerosis is diagnosed, things I'd never even heard of before I worked with this group. And by creating a dedicated space for those groups to come together, you create a dedicated voice for those groups in a way that you'll never get in a kind of mainstream participation project. So that's a really important part of participation for me, is that thinking about the different voices and how they are represented. And taking that forward a little bit, if you were looking at any sort of project, there's something about leadership there as well, that if you are, you would have different groups of young people in your project. Some may be taking on greater leadership roles than others. Some may be just participants, some may be designing and running the project with you, that you're making sure that the people who are in leadership positions are, that those leadership positions can be accessed by people from lots of different backgrounds, and really thinking through that. The final thing to think about in the context of projects is the idea of learning by experience. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this if you're from the youth sector, but it's really important to stress the connection between this and running a participative project and youth participation. So you've probably seen something like, or I hope you've seen something like the experiential learning cycle before. And the idea here is that if you compare it to a school, or if you compare it to this session I'm giving now, right now I'm teaching you. I'm giving you the information that's in my head, and I'm telling you this is the way it works. This is what I know about participation. And that's not giving you the same opportunity to come to your own conclusions, to come to your own judgments. You're kind of put in a position where you have to accept that the teacher is the higher power, the one with all the wisdom, the one with all of the knowledge. In a participative way of working with young people when you're running a project, you need to step out of that mold. You need to be alongside them and creating experiences and spaces where young people can say, organize or do something. Maybe it's running an event. They make their own choices and decisions about how that event works. Afterwards, they come together and they reflect on how that works. And then they go through a stage of conceptualizing, okay, what did we learn from doing that? We tried to run a campaign event. We think it was successful. These parts worked, these parts didn't work. Then we can go on when we move to the next stage, the active experimentation, where we'll try something different in future and we'll carry on with that. And what you're doing there is letting people learn from their own experiences, from the conversations and the discussions they have with each other and from the world around them, rather than positioning yourself as a kind of expert that's teaching them things. And that's a really, really important connection for me between non-formal education and participation, that we learn in a way that allows people to control and decide for themselves what they learn from things. And an important part of that in terms of leadership is the idea of what you would call self-directed group work. So that is, for me, if I'm creating a participation project, at the start of the project as a youth worker, I might be guiding and designing the process a little bit more carefully. I might be running the energizer at the start of the session, giving quite a clear structured plan so that the session works well, so that people get something out of it, so that it works positively. But as that time goes on, I'm going to be stepping back more and more from that role to let people themselves shape how the meetings go, how the sessions go, that I'm much, much less in that space and in control of that space. And so they get those initial skills at the start to understand what it is they're doing, to make it successful, and that then they can step up and be leaders in that space and kind of follow this learning process over and over, where they try to facilitate a session for the first time, they put it in place, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. So they know when they come to it the next time, they can try it a different sort of way. And that process of sort of stepping back as someone who is in that space as a youth worker, who is a kind of leader at the start, but reducing the amount of influence and control you have over how people are interacting together, how people are organizing things together, is really important to me, that you are sort of more and more giving people the space to direct and run the project how they want to, in a very, very sort of interpersonal kind of way, in the way they interact together. So for me, those are the kind of the four things to think about when you're thinking about how do I run a project in a participative way, and how do I think about leadership. I didn't put a summary slide on, so I'll run through them very quickly. First one is always be aiming to make change. Make it clear that you're committed to trying to make change, but you can't guarantee it. The second one is run your project in a participative way. Make sure that it's youth-led. Give people the opportunities to lead and take charge of different parts of the project. The third one is to make sure that you're thinking about who is involved, who gets those leadership opportunities, who gets to have a say in how your project is run. And the fourth one is making sure that people are learning from experience rather than you telling them all the answers or presuming that you know all the answers in the first place. That what they're doing is taking choices about how the project is run, learning from what happens in those, and going on to make new choices as a result of it. Not quite sure how I'm doing for time, but that pretty much brings me to the end of that slot. So I'm happy to take any questions. There's a lot of different concepts in there. That is a lot to take in. So if you want me to talk through one in a little bit more detail, now's a good chance to do it.
Dan, thank you very much. We do have some questions. We have a comment / reflection, I would say, from Andreas Panagiotou and Marie Heimburg as well, that is going on the same line more or less with what Andreas will tell us now, if that's okay. Andreas, can we pass you the floor?
Yeah, thank you. So basically, I've seen this approach of the scheme of taking participatory from the youth, just to calm concerns, just to overpass them, and not actually to be heard. And I've seen that from official projects. I'm an urbanist and architect, so I've seen that happening to projects in the city of Madrid or in the city of Beirut in Lebanon, just to say, okay, we hear what you want, but actually we just do it in order to move on with our processes without your revolute. And how do we do that without being that thing? Because it's not only what the others do, but we are organizing an event ourselves in next September. And I see the danger of this happening to us as well, because it's very tricky. Okay, we ask for participation and everything, but many times it's like we surpass. And I'm gonna give a personal example. We actually run a logo competition for new identity. And what happens is that we had participants from Europe that were very satisfied, but suddenly we had many complaints from Latin America and South Africa. And by discussing with a specific person from South Africa, because they speak English, not that we wanted to exclude the others, what we came up was the problem for that person was that in Europe, your copyrights are well copyrighted. So yeah, I'm the designer. I can use that logo to show to others. But I cannot use it for my commercial use to make money. That's what happens in Europe. But in South Africa, what happens is that if you give your drawing, your logo to a company, then you lose every right to it. You cannot even show it to clients. And the concern was, okay, you're giving 3 prizes. They're not huge amount of prize. They're normal prices. And what happens if I don't win because it's an international competition? Then I lose the rights to my design. Mm-hmm. So we needed to come up with notes on the copyright statement of our website in order to calm those concerns. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Also, there's a lot going on in that question. So if I understood the basis of it, it was about something like, how do you deal with it when young people are expressing their views on something and they those views might be not seriously listened to, not properly engaged with, and you might not create any sort of change. And then there was the bit about the copyright was also about how you communicate effectively what's going on when they do engage with you. I think you have to be really clear about what the rules of the game are before you start and what your position in the rules of the game are. And it's a little bit of a simplification to say that young people should always get what they want in youth participation and what they ask for. We sometimes we emphasize the importance of them being able to make change, but you also have to understand that young people exist in a society where there are lots of different competing interests and needs. So if what they want is counter to what another group wants, or if what they want might actually have been shown to be a very bad idea because it's been done somewhere else, there are often genuine reasons for not implementing what people say. And to give you the best example I've ever found in my career of that, I did some work looking at youth participation in youth prisons. The main issue that young people in youth prisons come up with when they go to the participation service is they want to get out of prison, which is fairly understandable in a way. But there is a genuine reason why they're not, why they're in prison that meets other society's needs. I'm not a big fan of putting young people in prison, but it shows the point very well that participation isn't as straightforward as giving people what they want. So as a worker, or as an organization, if you're doing something on behalf of decision makers like a consultation, you have to be really, really clear what people can influence and what people can't influence. If it's already understood that you can't influence these 3 topics, then don't run a consultation on them is the starting point. And that's if you're sort of doing something on behalf of the decision makers. If you're maybe more of an independent organization, you might still run a protest on those particular topics, but you still have to be clear that you might not be able to create some sort of change. And there is something about separating yourself as a participation worker from the people making decisions in this kind of context, that you can always approach the young people you're working with maximum authenticity to say, this is what I can do from you. This is where I think it might have influence. This is the areas I know you can't have any influence on because I understand the decisions have been made. And these are the areas where it's a bit more unclear. And then to find a way of communicating that effectively, what the parameters of the engagement and the opportunities you're offering are in terms of what can be expected, what can't be expected, and what's unknown. Which I think it sounds like you did very well in terms of being able to then communicate more effectively what the parameters of engagement for the logo competition were. And that's quite a hard thing to do, because you have to, as a youth worker or a participation worker, you have to have quite a good knowledge politically of what can be achieved and what can be changed. And you also have to reflect personally a lot on what are your judgments about what's realistic. So if you go back to that example of the bus companies I was talking about earlier, I said to you, we can never achieve improved bus services in our region because it just needs millions more pounds and we don't have that. That's not necessarily as true as that, because you could run a campaign across the entire country to change the way the national budget was allocated. Everything in the world can be changed. But my judgment and what I chose to communicate to the young people was, realistically, this is very much off the cards and we can't do something like that. So that's a kind of very extreme example. But when you get into the sort of much more the middle ground of where, say, you've had some good understanding of what the political situations are, and you know what you think people are likely to support, what you think people are not likely to support politically, you know what some of the other issues in your community are. Things aren't quite as black and white, and you have to give a bit more of a sort of honest assessment of this is what I think is the case, but I'm not really sure. In very big projects, that can be quite challenging because you don't have the space to talk one-to-one with people, to really talk through these issues, to go into a bit of deliberation about what are the ins and outs of it. When you start talking about very large-scale global projects or consultations where maybe people are only engaging with you through a website or something like that, you don't have the space to have that back and forth dialogue with people. But for me, creating that space as much as possible for really people to think about what they're doing, to receive guidance, not just from you, but from other experts who have worked on this particular issue or this topic that they're thinking about, is really a very important part of that sort of process. That people generally, if they understand what the rules of the game are when they go into it, will feel that they've had a positive process out of it. And then finally, just to bring that around, that question around, is participation just about making people, managing people so that they feel like they've been listened to? Actually, sometimes participation is about that. And sometimes it's about giving people the space to talk about what's important to them in their community and to understand why those things in that community are the way they are and why they aren't necessarily going to change. It's really important not to overlook the value of feelings in all of the participatory process, and feeling heard isn't just about getting the change you want, it's about feeling like your views were taken seriously, that you were engaged in a meaningful way, and that someone really recognized what you had to say, and you got a good dialogue, even if you didn't get the outcome that you wanted at the end. I think that's a really important thing to stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, once more. We will go back a little bit to another question that concerns the motivation of young people into projects. And I would like to give the floor to Eleni Boubouka from Greece, who is based in Switzerland at the moment. Eleni?
Yes, hello guys. So I'm going a little back, but at the same time, I heard a lot of things that they kind of answered my question. So as I realized, it's not, and I saw in the organization that I was for almost 3 years, that we really wanted to take people in because we wanted a high participation degree, as you said, Dan. But there were sometimes we were looking for them, but sometimes they were just coming to us because of the style of the organization that they could put in the CV, and they could use it as a professional experience. But I saw that there was a big difference on the people that they wanted this and the people that they could actually realize why, for example, exchange of students is really important for youth and really important for their life and their skills, and not for the curriculum also, but not, that was not the point. So what we do in this how it's called, in this option, like, so they were coming just for this, and we were trying to actually tell them that it's more than this, and it's more important to see the bigger picture, like the social impact in our community, in our university and everything. And I could see that they were not that motivated if I was going to the social aspect. So do we decline people when they're coming to us, or if we cannot convince them, or if you have a special picture of your organization and you cannot just create new projects or make different people aspects come true, what we do in that option?
Thank you very much for your question, Elena. I really understand exactly the sorts of inquiries from young people you're talking about. One of my first proper participation jobs was to run the youth parliament in an area that was very, very wealthy. So you can imagine when you put the name Parliament, Youth Parliament on something, you attract a lot of people who are career politicians and want to go on to be politicians. And you would get these emails like, I'm studying politics at school and I think this would be great to add to my CV. Come and join you. And I'm sort of like, no, we're about radical social change. And I think there's two questions there. One is, what do you do with inquiries from young people who are basically quite self-motivated and not necessarily willing to put the work in to support the aspects of your project and your organization that are important to your values? And the other question is, who do you exclude when you accept one group of young people over another? So the first question for me is, I mean, everyone has a right to participate, so I'm not too comfortable with the idea of turning people away, but that doesn't mean you have to put the same amount of support into everyone equally. So in that situation, you might say, okay, for the group of people who are already empowered enough and basically career motivated, we'll tell them when the meetings are and they can come up. If they want to come, that's fine. And that's about deciding who comes through the door. But for the group of young people that are the young people with disabilities, the young people who are about to be kicked out of school, the young people who are never going to send me an email like that saying, I want to join your project, I'm going to go out and visit them. I'm going to go out and visit their parents. I'm going to go out and visit their teachers. And I'm going to put the time in having the conversations with them to persuade them to get involved. So that then kind of balances the playing field a little bit, so that when you think about your inclusion, what you're doing is doing what you might call targeted recruitment and really putting the extra effort in to make sure you are attracting other people into your project who would not normally get in touch with you through this kind of already very motivated, wanting to be a career politician way. And that puts your project in an environment when both of those groups of young people come through the door, you've got two people from different halves of society there. And then what that gives you is an opportunity as an educator to talk about the values of social change, the values of social impact, to bring those groups of young people together into a dialogue about what's going on in their community. Let's imagine they're all from the same town, and to really bring people from different walks of life together to interact together, and to set what your project does as a whole. And it's fine for you as a program to say, these are the values that are important to us. If you want to come and engage with us and you want to be use our resources and become a participant in our project, we also expect certain things of you, and that you have to be committed to doing these kind of activities with us. But one of the other ways of thinking about that is by creating that experience for these different kind of young people from, say, very different backgrounds or with very different motivations to interact. What I would see in the projects I would run is that you would create some quite big changes and quite powerful changes in the young people who were perhaps very self-motivated when they came first. Now, some might get to a point where they say, this really isn't for me, I'm not interested in supporting all of these other people, and they might leave. But that's fine. You've communicated to them what the rules of engagement are, or the expectations of your project are, and they can make a choice. It's not for them. But others would, really challenge their own value bases, challenge their own assumptions, learn from the other people in the group, learn about people from different backgrounds. And I think one of the important things that I always held on to in that is to recognize that some of these young people who are very motivated, they're going to go on and do things in society, in the world, whether or not they take part in your project. If you say no to them, they're going to go somewhere else and join another project and join the young right-wing party wing or something like that. If you can, as an educator, affect some sort of positive change in them that makes them think more about the experiences of other people in the world, that makes them think more about the values of social justice, that has an impact later on in life in what they do, in what they do with their lives, and how they approach other people in the world. So there's a real kind of positive value to educating people to understand there is more than just their own personal interests. So I hope that was a clear enough answer. I mean, if you want to ask a follow-up or anything, please do feel free. But that would be, after spending a long time delivering a project that naturally attracted a lot of people in the group you're talking about, those were the sort of ways I had of thinking about it at the end of that.
Dan, I think you have covered the Lenny. She has sent a message to everybody thanking you. But great, we are going close. We're very close to the end of this moment that we're sharing with you live. I would say, and I need to admit actually that working with our participants yesterday and exploring a little bit, addressing a little bit youth participation, we looked at different opinions, of course, but also different perspectives. And somehow I was feeling today, maybe we can put youth participation with the help of Dan in a box, which was a very wrong word to use, because I feel, Dan, that in a very lovely way, you have been very descriptive for one thing, very insightful, but at the same time, I feel there is a call for reflection and a call for action also. Youth participation, in some sense and in some aspects of it, is very clear. Maybe in some others a little bit more abstract, but then also it depends on the context. Dan, I would like to thank you personally very, very much. Also with Andreas Andreu, co-training with me this training. Also, Stella Rusu for inviting you to this training course. The added value that you're bringing is it's a great thing. I would like to thank the participants as well very much, maybe more than anybody else, being here and contributing with the questions and the comments, and also the viewers that have joined us. Obviously, Paul at the back that you have seen every now and then, a beautiful image depicting a little bit this session and this time that we spent with Dan. And I would like to close, passing the floor back to Dan, maybe for one last comment.
Mm-hmm. What I would say, listening to what you've just said there, it's really great that we've opened this big box. There's so many things to think about in this. When you do your reflection, remember that your project doesn't have to do all of these things. It doesn't have to be everything. It doesn't have to address all of the issues in participation. Your project needs to be purposeful, and it needs to think about how it creates change. You don't have to solve with and engage every single issue in every single project. This is the landscape you're operating in. Maybe you want to grow a tree, maybe you want to grow a flower, maybe you want to grow a bush. That choice of what your project is will help you narrow it down to think about what you want to do and what you want to do with your work and how your work fits into this field.
Thank you, Dan.